In a previous video, we looked at Psalm 1 and its relationship to Psalm 2, and we went through a number of commentaries and commentators that noted this idea that we should perhaps read Psalms 1 and 2 together as something of a composite psalm. Even though they are individual psalms, there are themes that are connecting the two. This article by Robert Cole is going to further that argument and connect even more ideas. So I just kind of want to scrub through this article. I'm not going to read the whole thing verbatim. I can send you the article if you're interested. Now I'm going to pick up further down, and he's beginning this article by interacting with Jerome Creech, who had this other article called Like a Tree Planted by the Temple Stream. And this deserves its own video because it's quite interesting. But we'll pick up here, and you'll kind of see where Creech was going with his argument. But he says, not surprisingly, an integrated reading of Psalms 1 and 2 does support generally Creech's conclusion of seeing the righteous one of Psalm 1:3 as a tree in the holy temple on Mount Zion. So in other words, this is basically Creech's argument. In this study, it will be seen that the righteous one compared to a tree in Psalm 1 is further defined in Psalm 2 as the divinely chosen king installed on the holy mountain of Zion. And that more or less is the trajectory of this article, is that what is first picked up in Psalm 1 is further defined in Psalm 2. So he continues, the semantic resemblance between installed of 2:6 and transplanted of 1:3, both accompanied by the identical preposition, are one indication of equivalence. This individual is portrayed as a tree that gives its fruit at the appropriate time and as Yahweh's son to whom he promises to give the nations as his inheritance. That time at which the tree will bear its harvest of fruit is the now, when all kings of the earth are brought into submission to the chosen king ruling on Mount Zion. And he continues that Creech argued that the imagery of Psalm 1:3 portrayed a righteous person in the temple, citing Ezekiel 47:12 as the principal source for parallels, along with Psalms 46:5, 52:10, 65:10, 92:13 through 15. Much closer by, the parallel text of Psalm 2:6 reveals that the righteous one of Psalm 1:3 planted in the temple is identical to the king established on Mount Zion, the site of the sanctuary. Thus, the evidence cited by Creech from further afield for a temple context is supported in the immediately following Psalm 2. When the kindred Psalms 2 and 110 are compared, there is additional confirmation that the chosen king functions in a sacerdotal role, in other words, as a priest. And this actually sums up a lot of what we did in the first video. He says further linguistic ties are commonly cited and include the identical attribution of blessed or happy, depending on the translation, in 1:1 and 2:12, so kind of an inclusio. References to meditation or plot, usually it's translated that way, in Psalm 2, but in Psalm 1:2 and 2:1, and the repeated assurance of destruction of the way of the wicked in concluding verses of either psalm. What particularly binds Psalms 1 and 2 together closely is the conspicuous and commonly noticed absence of a superscription, otherwise common to practically all the subsequent psalms in books 1 through 3. And in that Psalm 1 video, we noted that among the very few times that you don't have a superscription, the psalm ties with what preceded it. Basically, the two psalms should probably be read together, and of course you do that here, and of course, that would argue that these two should be read together. Absence of a title at the head of Psalm 2, the inclusio formed by happy or blessed, at either end, and the presence of numerous verbal parallels strongly indicate an integrated understanding of both psalms in the Psalter's composition. But like I said, a lot of that is information we covered in the first video, but we'll just move further down and pick up. I'm not going to spend too much time on this portion, but here he's actually hitting on a number of similarities between Joshua and Psalm 2, as well as Psalm 1. And here he's talking about the language of, set themselves against, or however that's going to be translated. He says that this terminology in Psalm 2:2 is chosen deliberately for its intertextual resonance. The same root and pattern is found in Joshua 1:5 as a promise to Joshua himself that no one would stand against him. And of course, remember, Joshua is essentially the name Jesus. Obviously, the latter refers to military opposition, and the same can be applied here to Psalm 2. The battle imagery of 2:8 through 12 simply confirms the link with Joshua and the military conflict behind Psalm 2:2. And again, he's going to hit on a number of other parallels that are going on in these particular texts. This is worth bringing up, though. He says, however, there exists a notable difference of grammatical mood between Psalm 1:2 and Joshua 1:8. The latter, Joshua, is precative and the former is indicative. In other words, Joshua is enjoined to meditate continually in the Torah, while for the figure of Psalm 1, who I was arguing in that video, again, with a number of commentators, is the same figure of Psalm 2. It's the Messiah. This figure in Psalm 1, it is an accomplished fact. The same can be said comparing the conditional promise to Joshua of success with Psalm 1:3, where success is absolute and unqualified. Consequently, the blessed individual of Psalm 1 is portrayed as an ideal royal figure, greater than Joshua in his unswerving devotion to Yahweh's Torah and enjoying consequent success. And moving on, he says, it becomes increasingly clear that Psalms 1 and 2 at the head of the Psalter do not present two different themes of wisdom and or Torah and kingship, respectively, but rather both depict the ideal kingly warrior who enjoys complete domination of his enemies. And here he's connecting it to some of the Deuteronomy commands of that the king should meditate in the Torah and so on and so forth. And continuing on, he says, the content of Psalm 2's initial interrogative is motivated by the promise of the righteous king's success in Psalm 1:3 and the judgment in 1:5-6. Thus, the judgment of 1:5 was read in 2:1 as an assurance of the subjugation of rebellious rulers. And here's what he's getting at is the idea that these two things are linked. So in 1:5, Psalm 1:5, you have the references to judgment, and he's saying that it's assured in 2:1, again, the people that are plotting against the anointed, so on and so forth. But again, keep in mind that this is kind of where he's going with it, that what's introduced in Psalm 1 is going to be further elaborated on in Psalm 2. He continues, threatened judgment is inherent in the warning, be wise, to the kings of 2:10. A more explicit verbal link is provided by their identification as judges of the earth in verse 10. If the kings or judges of the earth do not submit to Yahweh and his king, they will be destroyed in the judgment promised for the wicked. Further support for this interpretation, linking the judgment in Psalm 1:5 with that of Psalm 2, comes from Psalm 149, 7-9, where the nations, peoples, and their kings come under the identical judgment. And it should be noted, Psalm 149 is the second to the last psalm. So, of course, you're dealing with Psalm 1 and 2 and Psalm 149. Then you have Psalm 150. Of course, the Septuagint has Psalm 151 as an additional psalm. But anyway, point is, it's forming something of an inclusio to the entire book. In this manner, Psalm 149 ties together the three consecutive verses, descriptions of judgment existing at the end of Psalm 1 and beginning of Psalm 2. Included in the judgment of 149:8 was the binding of kings corresponding to the bonds of Yahweh and his anointed, against which the kings of 2:2-3 chafed. When one includes the fact that the iron, also used in the judgment of 149:8, repeats the same used for the judgment of 2:9, it becomes clear that the linking of Psalm 2's judgment with that of 1:5 is confirmed by Psalm 149. And continuing down, this whole section is going to get very intense. I don't have the training for this, and I presume if you're watching this, you probably don't either. If you do understand everything about labiodental fricatives, you should be the one making this video. But I'm going to just hit basically the conclusions of what he's drawing on. So he writes here, an additional reason for the word, and this is rulers, or however that's going to be translated, in the warning of Psalm 2:10, is the resulting consonantal resonance created with the instrument of judgment in the previous verse, that is 2:9. And so this would be the rod. But he's saying the two consonants are identical. Again, it gets super technical, but his point here is you have, to transliterate, you have the S, a P, and a T, and here you have an S, a B, and a T. He says an auditory link between the instrument wielded in judgment and the earthly kings who are in danger of feeling its effects serves to sharpen the warning. And he's going to do this with the rest of this stuff. You have the desire for the kings to cast off from themselves the binding ropes, and again, the divine warning to be wise. Again, it hits much of the same stuff, L, K, and S. You have the similarities. Similarly, the command to serve Yahweh lest they be destroyed. Again, similar connections. He says both warning and threatened punishment are linked through consonants, for effect. He continues on, likewise, kings who do not fear with trembling will feel the effects of fiery divine wrath. And again, you can see some repeated lettering going on, creating this resonance between the different terms. Similarly, fear and the threatened burning. Again, you can see the similarity in the lettering. Examples of similar rhetorical devices can also be found in Psalm 1. The blessed king of Psalm 1:1 is contrasted with the wicked ones. And again, same thing, resh, shin, laryngeal, but in opposite order. That one's actually interesting. He says to heighten the antithesis. So you have some of the same lettering, but moving in different directions. The counsel of the wicked is sharply contrasted with the congregation of the righteous. Again, identical, or rather sequences of consonants, except for the T and the D in the third position. So, I'm sorry, this one, the T. But continuing on, I don't want to belabor the point, but he says the links between these two similes imply the eschatological judgment of Psalm 2 has already been introduced in Psalm 1. Gianni Barbiero has noted that the metaphor of chaff in Psalm 1:4 is eschatological, citing Isaiah 17:13, 41:15, Hosea 13:3, and Zephaniah 2:2. So the term chaff and its eschatological connotations in Psalm 1:4 cohere well with the references to the universal judgment of Psalm 2. And we noted in that Psalm 1 video that in the Greek, in the LXX, that you have the language that the ungodly would not stand up in the judgment, and that stand up language is one of our New Testament resurrection terms. And so I think that you have a pretty good argument that this is in fact eschatological judgment. But continuing on, he's pointing out here that the meditation, right? So the righteous one meditates on the Torah, while the ungodly, these wicked, are meditating, but we find out what their meditation is, and it's on their opposition to the Lord and his anointed. And this is where I think things get really interesting. He says the same pattern of having the second psalm supply information missing in the first exists in regard to the question of cession. According to Psalm 1:1, the counsel of the wicked is seated for purposes of derision, but the righteous monarch does not seat himself with them. Where then does the pious Torah meditating king sit? According to the pattern just seen, the reader should expect an answer in Psalm 2, and so it is. Not only is the same root utilized to make the link explicit, but consonance is again present. And again, is noting the similarities, similarities on a phonetic level. He says, it would appear then that 2:4 is revealing what Psalm 1 did not, namely the place in which the righteous one of Psalm 1 sits. However, one would presume that the only candidate possible for one sitting in the heavens would be the deity, and the reference to Adonai in 2:4b would seem to confirm this. Nevertheless, a closer look reveals that the answer to this problem is not so facile. The very fact that a pattern of further comments in Psalm 2 on the participants of Psalm 1 has been firmly established would lead one initially to identify the sitter of 2:4 as the ideal righteous, Joshua-like king of the previous psalm. In order to answer this question, further investigation of the immediate context is required. In other words, you would think the reference is referring to the Lord, but it would actually make more sense that the reference is to this Messiah figure. Now, of course, if you're a Christian coming into this, the answer is very obvious, right? Is it referencing the Lord, or is it referencing the Davidic Messiah? And you would say yes. That is, it is both at the same time. So continuing down, he's pointing out that basically Yahweh and his anointed are the ones at the receiving end of this revolt. So you would presume that their reactions, both of their reactions, would be recorded, but we only have a reaction from one, a singular particle, seated in heaven. So he's asking, does this include the anointed one? And is he enthroned in heaven or on earth? Presumably, he is on earth and does not qualify as subject of this participle. On the other hand, if one looks for the closest antecedent of the sitting, it would be the Messiah, it would be his anointed, rather, of 2b. Further, the sitting and laughing of verse 4 are decidedly human activities in reaction to the earthly scoffing. Nevertheless, they take place in the heavens, a decidedly divine abode. So that's kind of the interpreted difficulty, is who is it referring to? But as he points out here, he kind of concludes here, perhaps the ambiguity is deliberate. And very much what you get in these two powers type texts, I think it is ambiguous. Now, he's going to point out here that you would think then that the reference here to Adonai would clear up the matters, but it actually further muddies the waters a bit. And here he's going to get into why, and that has to do with Psalm 110. So here he's interacting with another scholar, and it's this. He basically had this idea of two, what does he call them? Two corresponding royal psalms. That is Psalm 2 and Psalm 110, which have particularly clear parallels. Both speak of the king as the ruler of the world who has been appointed by Yahweh himself. Indeed, the parallels are remarkably close to the point that they shed light on the identity of he who sits in the heavens of Psalm 2:4. In Psalm 110, Yahweh refers to the king as Adonai, meaning my Lord, if the Masoretic vocalization is followed. But if only the consonantal text is considered, it is identical with the Adonai of 2:4. Yahweh then commands this Lord to sit at his right hand, another direct parallel to the sitting of 2:4. The king of Psalm 110, seated with Yahweh at his right hand, rules with power from Zion, where the anointed king of Psalm 2 has also been established. He is installed on Zion, my holy mount, in 2:6, similar to the holy array, or more closely to the possible holy mountains of Psalm 110, verse 3. And if you look at Psalm 110, verse 3 specifically, there are some that amend the text to a reference to holy mountains rather than this language of holy array or holy attire or whatever. So that would constitute a direct link. In both Psalms, the king is addressed by Yahweh through the second masculine singular pronoun, and it's usually going to be translated you, in one case to declare his sonship, and in the other, his sacerdotal role. In other words, in Psalm 110, it's that you are a priest after the order of Melchizedek, that kind of idea. Both Psalms are dominated by the language of warfare, in which the king's enemies are subdued when divine anger is kindled. The enemy in both cases is the nations, and especially their rulers. Yahweh's king is specified in either psalm by the identical my king. Without a doubt, Psalm 110 is an appropriate psalm through which to understand Psalm 2. Of particular importance is the conflation, as David Mitchell puts it, of the figures of Yahweh and the king in Psalm 110. In light of the fact that the king is addressed in Psalm 110 as Lord and is seated with Yahweh, the ambiguity of 2:4 is proven to be deliberate. Continuing on, the heavenly seated one of 2:4, identified as Lord, is none other than the Lord of Psalm 110:1, seated at the right hand of Yahweh. Later in Psalm 110, verse 5, Yahweh is also addressed as Lord and as at the right hand of the king. Consequently, the singular seated, or the seated language, and the divine name Lord of 2:4 designate a deliberate fusion of both Yahweh and his anointed king, continuing an amalgamation begun in verses 2 and 3. The anointed king sits at Yahweh's right hand in Psalm 110, and so likewise qualifies as the one sitting in the heavens of 2:4. His laughter and derision towards the rebellious rulers of verses 2 and 3 corresponds directly to the scoffing of his rivals in 1:1, following the pattern already well established between the two psalms. In other words, what is set up in Psalm 1 is finished or answered in Psalm 2. And continuing further down, he says, not surprisingly, the voice uttering these final three verses reveals another example of fusion between the chosen king and Yahweh, as it did in verses 1 through 5. So the point is, there are some points that become clear that it's one person speaking, like it's the Lord speaking or whatever. But again, you have another example at the end of fusion, and specifically the language of his anger, his wrath. So the question is it the Lord as in Yahweh, or is it this Messiah figure? Whose wrath exactly are we talking about? Like, for example, he says here, so it is with, again, anger or wrath in verse 12b, whose antecedent is both the Son, or verse 12a, and Yahweh of 11a. He continues, attribution of the anger in verse 12b to the Son King is consistent with verse 9, where he is smashing his enemies with an iron rod as potter shatters vessels. The footnote is interesting to this. I want to get to it. But he says, such images clearly imply anger, if nothing else, and so correspond directly to the destruction carried out in verse 12. Here he points out one of my favorites here. So he notes again above, he talked about how the consonance was created between the instrument of destruction, the rod, and those judges or rulers of the earth about to feel its effects. So there was a connection between those two. And he says, again, we have another one of these. In verse 9 and now verse 12 is another instance, created this time between the wielder of the rod and its material. This rod is made of iron, barzel, and the one employing it is the sun, bar. Such a wordplay follows a pattern seen previously. And this one's really interesting because there are some that make quite a bit out of the fact that this is actually an Aramaic term as opposed to Hebrew, because you actually do have a Hebrew reference, bin. You have it earlier in the psalm, but here you have the Aramaic term. So people sometimes think it shouldn't be translated sun here, whatever, but it may very well just be an attempt at wordplay. So some are deeply bothered by why there's potentially an Aramaic word here. Although this footnote does provide some evidence. He's pointing out here that you get this actually in Psalm 31:5, where a Gentile king is warned regarding his conduct. And so if you come across that idea, this particular section is actually quite useful. But I wanted to look at this other one where the breaking, with the rod, with the iron rod, the potter shatters vessels, all of that language. And this is that breaking them language from the root to break, which certainly accords better with the destruction of verses 9b and 12 and the dominant mood of anger in Psalm 2. The allusion to Joshua's violent military success in Psalm 1:3 to describe the righteous one, now designated as son in Psalm 2, offers further support for the choice of this verbal root, which BDB calls an Aramaic loanword. On the other hand, the idea of shepherding is a valid option given the use of the same verb and noun in Psalm 23:1 and verse 4. Sometimes you'll see this translated different ways. You'll rule them with a rod of iron, or you'll break them with a rod of iron. So it's like, which one is it? And he concludes here, and I think he's right. Could this be a polysemantic pun understood by bilingual readers? Submission to this king, as commanded in verses 10 through 12, would result in shepherding, while disobedience would result in shattering. Verses 9b and 12b through C describe the fate of the disobedient, while 12d describes that of the former. And in fact, this is actually interesting because the very end of Psalm 2, it talks about blessed. And again, there you have the inclusio all the way back to the beginning of Psalm 1:1. It says, blessed are all who take refuge in him. But if you go throughout the rest of the Psalter and the rest of the Old Testament for that matter, we take refuge not in people, we take refuge in the Lord, right, in God. And this would just be another element of that fusion of the Messiah figure with God. But I think is right. And of course, if this is, as he calls it, a polysemantic pun, in other words, between Aramaic and Hebrew, you have this pun, where if you read in one language, you get one part, you read in another language, you get the other aspect of the pun. It would also lend support to the idea that it wouldn't be so crazy to have another Aramaic term that is, in this case, bar or sun in Aramaic. It wouldn't be so out of context, it would already have happened previously in the psalm itself. But continuing on, again, he says the imperative kiss the sun, demanded of the kings, also resonates phonetically with the earlier divine establishment in Mount Zion, so he hits on some of that. He says the phonetic parallels heighten the necessity of earthly rulers responding appropriately to the heavenly appointed monarch. And moving down, we'll just hit the conclusion. I don't want to make this video too long. He says, in conclusion, the Psalter's introduction has as its principal subject matter a righteous and royal figure who is granted complete military dominance over wicked rulers from his heavenly throne, in seeming contradiction to the promise of 1:5 through 6. And this is the promise of judgment or destruction of the wicked. The conclave of scheming nations in Psalm 2:1 through 3 has revolted against the authority of Yahweh and his king. Nonetheless, the latter will destroy them in a violent and wrathful judgment. Psalm 2, verses 8 through 12, as a confirmation of the original promise in the first psalm. The battle is undoubtedly to be understood as the final eschatological conflagration ushering in the kingdom of God through his anointed king. Psalms 1 and 2 were not read as two disparate Torah and royal psalms, respectively, in the final redaction of the Psalter, and you read that all the time in commentaries. Rather, both depict the ideal Joshua-like warrior and king who, through divinely given authority, vanquishes his enemies. So I think that this idea, this connection between Psalm 1 and 2, really reaffirms the idea that you get in the New Testament, even by Jesus' own words, that all of this everything in the Old Testament was more or less pointing to the Messiah. So it's easy to read the Psalms and just immediately think of personal application. And there is that. But it applies to us in that it first applies to Christ. And a good example, I think, of that idea is you actually get this in Revelation 2, where Jesus applies Psalm 2, a very messianic psalm. He applies it to believers. So I'm not denying that it applies to us, but it applies to us in that Christ fulfills it. Now, kind of as a bit of a bonus, I do want to go through Labuschagne's stuff as with regards to some of the numerical aspects of the psalm, because I think that, again, we're going to run into divine numbers. And I think that it reinforces that this psalm is very much kind of a two powers text, I think. I think if you properly understand it, it does fall within that idea. So he's pointing out here that the center of the entire poem, it's 92 words total, but the center of it is, he said to me in verse 7. But he's going to go on and point out that you probably have a better candidate here in terms of the 28 cola, I think that's how you pronounce that, of the poem. And these are essentially lines. I'm not sure what the difference between a line and a cola is, if there even is a difference. But he says that the two middle in verses 7a and b situated in the seventh verse line, the meaningful center is significantly surrounded by 26 cola with 13 on each side. And so you have 13, again, essentially lines. If you were to if you go to Psalm 2 and just count the lines, 13 lines down, you would end up here. I shall announce a decree. Yahweh said to me, you are my son. You are. I don't know why he wrote this like Yoda. My son are you. But and then if you were to count 13 lines after that, you would get the end of the psalm. So this is the center of the psalm. And of course, it's flanked by 26 total lines, which is the numerical value of Yahweh. But in addition to that, he doesn't point it out, I don't think here, but he points it out in other contexts, that 13 itself is significant because 13 is the numerical value of the term one in Hebrew. So the Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The value of that is 13. And that's not eisegetical, I think, to point this out, because you actually get this in the New Testament, in one of these early creedal confessions of Jesus, where it says, we have one God, the Father, and we have one Lord, Jesus Christ. So you have one, and the entirety of that creed is 26 words, and it's set up in the 13-13 symmetry. Of course, 13 being one, 26 total being the value of Yahweh. And it's just very interesting because that has a very two powers type flavor to it. And so even in the composition numerically, you get that. And he says here that it has a concentric pattern. It goes 7 plus 6, and then the center 2 plus 6 plus 7. So it forms this numerical chiasm. He also points out here that the numbers 7 and 4, respectively, the number of fullness and the number of universality, representing the four corners of the earth, play an important role in giving the structure to the text. Of course, that would be the 28, 7 times 4. And he points out here that this other commentator made a tentative suggestion that this symbolically expresses the universal rule of the Messianic king. And he says, may well, in my opinion, be precisely what the author of the poem intended. You get this like in Revelation, where the merchants of the earth export or import, I forget which one, 28 items specifically. Again, it's 7 times 4. So this is established elsewhere in Scripture, this principle. Also, 17 is one of our other values of the divine name Yahweh. And the speaker, in verses 1 through 6, the speaker uses 34 words to set the stage of the first decree. And then you have a 7-word divine decree surrounded by exactly 85 words, 85 being 5 times 17. So you have, again, divine numbers in both of those. And interestingly enough, the total value here, he says, the number of words in the two divine decrees amount to 26, 7 plus 19. So that is, the Lord directly is going to speak 26 words, as well as 26 words are actually also directed at the rebellious nations as well. But that is the number stuff. You can find so much of Labuschagne's work. I mean, it's basically just online. So if you ever want to look up any more of what he writes, just search his name. Let's see, where is his name? Should be at the very top. Actually, it's not at the top, but at least a footnote will have it. Yep, Caspar Labuschagne, or Labuschagny. And whatever you're looking into, he's probably in the Old Testament written about it. So yeah, that's just a lot to think about. And that's that we didn't even touch any of the other commentaries regarding Psalm 2. But I think that there is something to think about with regards to these two psalms being connected, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. And it has deep messianic connections as well as that idea, that fusing of the Messiah with the divine. This is not some New Testament invention. It's in Psalm 1 and 2, which are the opening, the introduction to the Psalter, have this figure who is fused with Yahweh, a human. I mean, that's the bedrock of Orthodox Christianity, and it's right there as an introduction to the Psalms, to the liturgy of the people of God. I mean, it's just, come on. But that is that, and again, let me know if you want me to go through more Psalms, because I find it really interesting, especially just so many of the patterns that emerge. But I will see you guys probably with Chronicles in the near future, but later.